Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here. I'm really privileged and honored to have the opportunity to talk to you about the Arizona law. I have a unique perspective on this law because I actually went to law school in Arizona. And I worked with the legislature there, and I worked with Jan Brewer when I was there. I knew Russell Pierce when I lived there. I knew a lot of the people that are involved in this law today. And what tragically has come out of this law is what appears to be a Republican-Democrat divide on the issue of immigration. And I have never viewed immigration as divided along party lines. Immigration has historically been one of those issues that is not a Republican-Democrat issue. But this vitriol and this attack on immigrants seems to be coming mostly from the Republican Party, which is tragic to me as a Republican, because I don't think Republican values actually stand for these types of laws today. And yet here we have in Georgia a group of legislators who want to ride on the same path that the legislators in Arizona rode to. For what purpose? Well, let's talk a little bit about that law in Arizona. Now, everybody's heard of SB 1070. That was the law that kind of started the way. Most people don't know that SB 1070 actually is not the law that passed, that became the Arizona immigration law. It was actually amended shortly before Governor Brewer signed it to change a couple things by the author of that bill. Now, the author of that bill, does anybody know who that was? Now, everybody's going to say, well, Russell Pierce is the senator from Arizona who claims authorship, and the reality is Russell Pierce did not write that bill. The Arizona law and virtually every other incarnation of that law, and I can almost guarantee you the law that will be introduced here in Georgia, is written by a guy named Kuck. Chris is a professor of law at the University of Kansas. He's also currently running for the Secretary of State as a Republican in Kansas. And Kuck got his start in immigration working under Attorney General Ashcroft to pass the regulation that required all Muslims to register with the government shortly after September 11th throughout the United States. That's the background that the author of this bill comes from. The author of the bill has also been previously employed by FAIR, the Federation Against Immigration Reform, I think I got that right, and the Center for Immigration Studies. That's where his background is on this. And that's who's writing these laws. Now, the Arizona law, you have to understand, had about 14 different provisions in it that applied to a regulatory enforcement scheme in that state on immigration. 12 of those laws were approved by the judge. The entire law was not stricken down. In fact, the federal court judge who heard this case, Judge Bolton, only struck down 4 specific provisions of that law. That means that 12 of those provisions are in force in Arizona today and could easily be enforced here in Georgia. These provisions are not necessarily unconstitutional and can probably pass a lawsuit test through the district court and probably through the circuit court here. So all these laws are going to be okay. If they want to pass a law that says that here in Georgia, they can do that. And others will talk about the ramifications of that law. But the 4 things in that law that Judge Bolton found unconstitutional were probably the 4 most egregious, if you don't consider these egregious, the 4 more egregious provisions. The key one in this was it authorized police officers, when making a lawful stop, that if they had a reasonable suspicion to believe that somebody was a, quote, illegal alien, a term, by the way, not defined by federal law, that they then could detain that person to obtain confirmation as to whether or not they were documented. Now, of course, the concern with that law is how do you actually determine and create a reasonable suspicion that somebody's undocumented? Well, heck, that's easy. They're not white. Isn't that what people thought? That's clearly what people thought. The law doesn't say that. But what other criteria are there? In fact, Congressman King from Iowa said, well, it's easy. You can tell by the shoes they wear. No, I'm not kidding. You can't make this stuff up. Type of hat they wear, how they wear their clothes, whether somebody is legal or not. Congressman King from Iowa said that on national television. How do you tell whether somebody is undocumented or illegal or not lawfully present in the United States? The reality is, without forcing them to present documents, you can't. But you can't lawfully ask them to present documents without a reasonable suspicion. And what District Court Judge Bolton said was, that's a violation of the 4th Amendment of the United States Constitution. An amendment that applies to all persons In the United States, persons means human beings. And everybody is a human being that's breathing today, regardless of their immigration status. So she struck that down and said, I'm not going to rule that as valid, and that part of the law is out the door. Second, it made it unlawful not to carry your immigration papers if you are legal. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but that's already the federal law. That federal law passed in 1940 as part of what is called the Alien Registration Act. Shortly before the attack on Pearl Harbor and our entry into World War II, in the midst of, frankly, another round of anti-immigration sentiment in the United States, Congress passed the Alien Registration Act. What the judge said was, your state law is preempted by the federal law, and therefore invalid. Third, she said it was also an invalid part of this law to not allow people to solicit work unless they were documented or legal in the United States. So it disallowed people from being day laborers or looking for work unless they had with them papers to show their employment eligibility. And she found that that violated the Commerce Clause. And finally, the last and probably the most important provision in this law, where it required the sheriff, when they arrested somebody, to actually determine somebody's immigration status unless they could prove they were a citizen. And she found that unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment because it violated somebody's right to have a warrant before a search and seizure is conducted. Now, can these laws, the question you have to ask yourself, can these four provisions be changed in such a way that they would no longer be unconstitutional? And the answer is maybe. Could they be tweaked a little bit? Maybe. Is the Georgia legislature going to try to do that? Absolutely. Congress today allots $17 billion to immigration enforcement. Crime is down in Georgia. Crime is down in Arizona. And yet these are reasons given for passing an anti-immigration law, a law in which the federal government already acts in virtually every area. So the question is, why aren't our state legislators, instead of passing a law like this, walking up to Capitol Hill and demanding that Saxby Chambliss and Johnny Isakson and every one of our congressmen pass some type of immigration reform that solves this problem and the reasons that cause this problem? Can you enforce your way out of this problem? And the answer is no. We cannot enforce our way out of this problem. But until state legislators like the ones in Georgia or Arizona or Utah or Tennessee or South Carolina or the 20 or 30 other states that are considering this type of legislation demand that their federal legislators stop playing games with this law and come around and make a law that serves America, that creates economic opportunity for Americans and for immigrants, that lets the right people in to do the right jobs at the right time, we will not solve this problem. And instead, we will cause economic disaster and chaos there in the state. We will destroy families. We will separate parents from children. And we will end up doing nothing to solve the situation. Thank you.